Okay, we're in verse 14 of chapter 1, kind of following up from the last video, a little bit of a second half because we're still halfway through verse 14 in chapter 1. It's a big verse, so that's one reason to sit on it a little longer. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So there's a lot in this verse 14. I talked about it in the last video, the word, the logos becoming flesh, sarx, and dwelling among us. And the word dwelling is a word that has its root in the tabernacle. It's connected to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. So it's this idea that the word, the logos who's coming to dwell is like that God dwelling in the tent with Moses and the people, is making that connection. So that's a really nice connection. Also, the word becoming flesh, I didn't touch on that, but the word flesh, the word in Greek is sarx. The word glory is doxa. And this is maybe another really important, there's a lot of symbolism in John, lots of it. But this is also a very important one that he carries through. The idea that the incarnation, right, the word becoming a human being, and here the translation is flesh, and then it talks about glory right after that. So we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. These are connected in an interesting way, incarnation and how do we see God, right? How does Jesus reveal God? And it's a little bit different than the synoptic gospels. John usually has the reputation of being the more spiritual one, and sometimes people talk about Jesus and John as maybe floating above a little bit more, like being a little more divine than human. But it's interesting that John is very particular about saying that the glory of God is found in the flesh, right? It's found in the person of Jesus as a human, that it's not something extra. If you think about, is it Philip? I think Philip asks, show us the Father towards the end of John's Gospel, like chapter 14. Philip says, finally you're telling us the bottom line here, show us the Father. And Jesus is sad by that. And Jesus says, haven't you been with me? Haven't you seen me? This idea that God's glory is contained in this stuff here. And another really interesting point in John's Gospel, there is no transfiguration. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all have the transfiguration where Jesus is, shines like the sun and clothes are dazzling. They turn white. It's like lightning. He looks all shiny. This really kind of divine nature coming through, right? That's the transfiguration. John doesn't have one. John doesn't tell that story. And I think that goes to the point that John is really saying the glory that, maybe we think of when we think of the transfiguration, the real glory is contained in the person of Jesus, in his flesh. And that we'll see that later. But this is where it begins, right? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw that glory of him. And the one and only is also a John theme, the only Son kind of theme, which fits in well with the Trinity. Nowhere in here is the Trinity spelled out, but there's a lot of talk about Spirit, and there's a lot of talk about Jesus as the only child or Son. So kind of bits and pieces of that. All right, so that's verse 14, big verse. Let's see how we're doing here, 4 minutes. We'll go verse 15. John testified concerning him and cried out, saying, "This is he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me." So John's testimony, his witness, right? We're hearing that word witness again, testimony, is saying that he's hearkening back to the verse 1, verse 2, right? The Word who was in the beginning with God, right? He was before me, he says. So he's tapping back into that. And his idea about he has surpassed me, right? This is John's mission is to witness to the light and then diminish himself. His life or light diminishes as Jesus grows, as people know about him. So much so that John will have his own disciples, tell them to follow Jesus and stop following John. And we'll see that in just a little bit here too, in the introduction. Okay, let's see, 5 minutes. Verse 16. From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. And this is the word grace is used here, charis, received one blessing after another. So grace is hit here in 16, in verse 14 we heard it, and now in verse 16. And then we hear in verse 17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So we hear this grace, grace, grace. There's used 4 times here, right, in chapter 1. And an interesting point of that is that we don't hear that word again. We don't hear the word grace, charis, again in this section, or in the rest of the gospel. So we hear it 4 times and then it's done. And then in 17, it's also this idea that Jesus is bringing something different than Moses. Again, there's no transfiguration, so Moses doesn't show up like Moses and Elijah on the mountain with Jesus. That's not in John's gospel. Here he makes that distinction between Moses, the law bringer, and Jesus, the grace bringer. And so verse 17 does that. Verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. So here this one and only is referring to the Logos, right? The Word. God, the one and only, how, was with God and was God. This one makes the Father known. This one who is with God and was God in verse 18. So you can't see him. Seeing is also a John theme. Seeing and knowing, we'll see that later. But only the Logos can really make the Father known. So, yeah, that's probably good. Stop there, verse 18, and we'll pick up the next video with verse 19. Thank you.